We're standing here in the Pool of Siloam, near the exit of Hezekiah's tunnel. In 2 Kings 20:20, we learn that King Hezekiah dug the tunnel to bring water into the city. This was done as a preparation because there was an impending attack from the Assyrians. The tunnel starts at Gihon Springs on the eastern side of the city of David and winds its way underground for about a third of a mile to the Pool of Siloam here in the old part of Jerusalem. And another interesting fact is Jesus in the New Testament was also here. In John 9:7, this is near where Jesus rubbed the mud on the blind man's eyes and then told the blind man to go wash his eyes and experience healing in the Pool of Siloam. So fascinating. You know, in 1880, an inscription was found that is now known as the Siloam inscription because it was found about 20 feet from the southern end of the tunnel near the Pool of Siloam. The ancient Hebrew inscription written at the time of Hezekiah tells the story of the construction of the tunnel. It reads, "When the tunnel was driven through, each man toward his fellow, and while there were still 3 cubits to be cut through, a voice of a man calling to his fellow. And when the tunnel was driven through, the quarrymen hewed each toward his fellow, axe against axe, and the water flowed from the spring toward the reservoir for 1,200 cubits, and the height of the rock above the heads of the quarrymen was 100 cubits. This inscription is amazing. It details the project to actually dig the tunnel at the time of Hezekiah. One of the most interesting aspects of the tunnel is that it's in an S shape. Based on that inscription I just read, it seems that the workers were working on opposite sides, calling to each other in order to meet in the middle and finish the tunnel. The tunnel served as a very important strategic accomplishment for Judah. Now, from a spiritual standpoint, this tunnel is also a picture of the people's desperate need for water. As long as they had a connection to living water, they could live, even if an enemy army surrounded the city and prevented them from carrying water in from the outside sources. With this tunnel, now they had an inside source of living water that wouldn't run dry. What a beautiful visual to Jesus in the New Testament, bringing us living water that won't ever run dry. With God, who is our spring or our source, as Jeremiah 2:13 says, the fountain of living water, which the literal Hebrew translation for fountain is source. God is our source of living water. You know, every test we face in our faith is an opportunity to return to our source of faith, the living water that flows from God. King Hezekiah, he started off so strong with staying connected to God. But let's pick up where we left off in our study last week and see where his trusting of himself became more evident than his trust of God. One of the ways we can get more insight into the kings we've been studying is to turn to 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's almost like these books are like a commentary that give us different perspectives so we can see the story with better clarity. For example, last week we spent a lot of time talking about Hezekiah. In day 5, we unpacked how Hezekiah started to build up treasure for himself and then ultimately showed off all that he had to those Babylonian guests. We may wonder, was that really that bad? Well, let's read 2 Chronicles 32:27 through 31 together. Now, as we read, I want you to pay close attention to how Hezekiah perceives his riches and what the author of Chronicles teaches us about the true source of King Hezekiah's riches. And Hezekiah had very great riches and honor, and he made for himself treasuries for silver, for gold, for precious stones, for spices, for shields, and for all kinds of costly vessels. Storehouses also for the yield of grain, wine, and oil, and stalls for all kinds of cattle and sheepfolds. He likewise provided cities for himself, and flocks and herds in abundance, for God had given him very great possessions. This same Hezekiah closed the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon and directed them down to the west side of the city of David, and Hezekiah prospered in all his works. And so, in the matter of the envoys of the princes of Babylon who had been sent to him to inquire about the sign that had been done in the land, God left him to himself in order to test him and to know all that was in his heart. It's truly amazing to read about all that Hezekiah had, the riches, the stability, the success, all the abundance a king could possibly ask for. But how does this apply to us? It's so interesting to come across verse 31 and read that God left him to himself in order to test him and to know all that was in his heart. The phrase, "and so," in verse 31 shows us the connection between the riches and the testing. Now, let's read 2 Kings 20:14 through 19 to see how this test played out. And I think you'll see the test didn't go so well for Hezekiah. Then Isaiah the prophet came to King Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say, and from where did they come to you?" And Hezekiah said, "They have come from a far country, from Babylon." He said, "What have they seen in your house?" And Hezekiah answered, "They have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them." Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons, who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good." For he thought, "Why not, if there will be peace and security in my days?" If verse 19, his absolute uncaring attitude about his children and his grandchildren seems as shocking to you as me, hold on, because I am going to revisit this in a moment. But here's what this reveals about his heart: pride, overconfidence in worldly wealth, him taking credit for God's provision, bragging and showing off all to impress the people of Babylon, a lack of common sense and care for the people he's leading, and a total lack of character and concern for those future generations. The irony is, this is the condition of his heart after experiencing God's faithfulness. This really should be a strong reminder here that our heart should get more humble, not more haughty, after experiencing a move of God. Remember, we read this week about the miraculous healing Hezekiah experienced right before the visit of those Babylonians. You see, often our tests of trust take place after God has proven himself faithful. This is really important for us to keep in mind. Never are we more confident than when we've seen God move, but never are we more at risk of getting too confident in ourselves than when we've seen God move. And honestly, I think that's because we secretly think that God's faithfulness is somehow tied to all we did right to deserve this. But when we mistakenly think it was our faithfulness that brought about this move of God, we disconnect from the miraculous working power of God's faithfulness. Let's take another look at Hezekiah's prayer, where he basically asked God to remember what he did in being so faithful to God. 2 Kings 20, verses 2 through 3. Then Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord, saying, "Now, O Lord, please remember how I have walked before you in faithfulness and with a whole heart, and have done what is good in your sight." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. This isn't just a situational observation from the life of Hezekiah. It's a warning to us all. Have you ever admired someone who seemed to be walking so closely with the Lord, rock solid in their faith, experiencing the blessings of God, and you thought to yourself, wow, they really have it all together? And then all of a sudden you hear that they've completely walked away from their family and turned away from God? Their choices stun you. Their selfishness confuses you. And you can't help but wonder, what on earth happened? Me too. I hear from people every day who are living this story with their spouse, who they thought was so close to God and experiencing the faithfulness of God. And then suddenly that spouse just picks up their things and walks away to live a life completely apart from God. I've seen this happen up close and personal to people I deeply love, and it's so shocking. But instead of staying in that shock that it does happen, I want this to shake me and wake me up to this warning for myself. Our response to God's faithfulness should be a response to pursue holiness. To be holy is to be set apart. It's what God wanted for his kings and for his people. This is exactly why God gives the Israelites the law, the Torah. It wasn't a task list of something to enslave them. It was meant to identify them with God and to set them apart from every other nation around them. It was really a gift intended to guide them toward holiness. Have you seen God's faithfulness in your life? How has it made you pursue holiness on even deeper levels with God? This isn't meant to question or to condemn you or me. It's meant for us to take a step back and consider some things. Are our blessings making us press into God more faithfully, or have those blessings become a distraction, deterring us from God? Have our experiences with God made us more humble or more prideful? More aware of others' needs or more disconnected from being concerned about others? More hungry for studying God's words and God's ways, or more resistant to pausing the rush of the day for a few quiet moments with God? Please hear my tender honesty here. I'm preaching this to myself, and I'm wanting just to provide a safe place here for us to be more self-aware and open to being course corrected today. God is trustworthy. That's not the question. Are we trustworthy? I think that's the real question. We have to move from being terrified at the thought that God would test us in our trust to being overwhelmed by the reality that God would trust us with the test. God isn't giving this test to enslave you or ensnare you. God is entrusting you. What an amazing reality that God would entrust a test to us. The heart issue revealed in Hezekiah's test didn't just happen on the one day of the Babylonian visitors. This was a slow slide of his heart being pulled more and more away from God. And how our heart goes, our mind goes. And how our mind goes, our mouth will follow. The bragging that came from his mouth was a self-boasting decision made in his heart and in his mind. I think the time to settle the decision to become more holy with each experience with God's faithfulness is now. Will we become more holy and dependent on God, or more haughty and bragging or self-boasting? This is a decision we make in our hearts before it becomes thoughts in our minds that eventually becomes words that come out of our mouths. Remember why we're here today. One of the biggest accomplishments in Hezekiah's life, this tunnel that ended right here at the Pool of Siloam, the one accomplishment of his that is still standing to this day, was almost like a pretest of where his heart would turn. Would he see this accomplishment as evidence of God's faithfulness, or would he see it as evidence of his own strategic and military brilliance? Sadly, we see a heart disconnected from God, and even more sad to me, a heart so unconcerned about future generations. When the prophet Isaiah questions why Hezekiah showed off his wealth to the Babylonians, like I mentioned before, I'm so shocked by his response recorded in 2 Kings 20:19. Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good." For he thought, why not? If there will be peace and security in my days. I don't know about you guys, but I honestly have no words to the selfishness of his response. God, may it never be so in my life. I don't want to start off strong, and then the more I experience your faithfulness, take so much credit for myself that I just completely blow it in the end. Let this lesson be a stopgate to wherever this might be happening in my life, big or small. I wonder what would have happened if Hezekiah would have checked his heart with this accomplishment, the tunnel, before the test with the Babylonian visit, and used it to drive himself to humility, to acknowledge God's faithfulness in his life, rather than just saying, wow, look at how awesome I am. So let's bring this home. Where are we experiencing God's faithfulness right now? What blessings are we living in the midst of that has started to seem so commonplace that we wrongly believe we earned this or we acquired this on our own. What is our response now that we realize that all we have is such rich evidence of God's trustworthiness in our lives? Now, how trustworthy are we? I don't know about you, but this teaching is certainly causing me to reevaluate some things in my life and kneel with greater humility to the one who over and over and over shows how trustworthy he is.